Ahoy! In this video I'd like to discuss Odo as well as Michael as the artifacts and potential alternatives, because a lot of people have been asking me about them, and I think there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misconception when it comes to the artifacts or how you should be building flails in general. So let's begin with the artifacts and then look into the alternatives. The first one here is Odo. Odo has Magnify. It's annoying in itself, but it's not something bad at least. The first perk here, which you have essentially in place of a gem slot, is Odo's Punishment, and it's very bad. You deal 20% more damage to stunned foes, and it works on both weapons. Problem is, the flail doesn't have any stun, so it only really works on your other weapon for the most part, unless you switch over to your flail from there. And then the flail itself doesn't do that much damage, it doesn't do anything big with openers, and the effect breaks within a single attack, because every stun is broken within a single attack. I could imagine some super niche Warhammer build where you can stun someone and then do massive damage afterwards with this, maybe, but for anyone who wants to consistently use flail and focus on the flail in their builds and the benefits of the flail, this doesn't really have any reason to exist. The second perk is Odo's Defense, and Odo's Defense is kind of weird when you look at it like this, so let's look at the PTR version to make a bit more sense of it. This was what it used to look like on PTR. On block, heal for 5% of your base health. That was pretty solid. It wasn't insane in my opinion, but it was solid. It was maybe a bit too much, and that's why they nerfed it, but they, in my opinion, absolutely over-nerfed it, because now the same perk has a 3-second cooldown. And 5% base health every 3 seconds, I think roughly 400 health, and it doesn't matter how much total health you have, because it scales with your base health. Not very impressive at all. Once again, a perk that is relatively weak. Then we have Life Stealing, which is not a bad perk, but also not a priority perk, and also one that benefits you more if your weapon does a lot of damage to begin with, which the flail does not. It's not really a pure damage weapon, but more of a utility weapon. So it's okay, but most certainly not something I would deeply invest into. Then we have Refreshing Move, which is arguably the only really good perk on this flail, on Odo, but there are also other ways to get Refreshing Move, so not necessarily the best thing to have either. It depends on what exactly you're after in terms of perks. So those are your main perks. I think you may be able to put a gem slot on this. As far as I'm aware, this is not one of the ones that's locked out, so that's probably what you're going to do, or you put some damage perk on it or whatever. Doesn't really matter. There are better options for your flail. In my opinion, overall, this is one of the worst artifacts in the game. On Odo, it's also worth pointing out that if you're using the last random perk slot for a gem slot, then you cannot get Burning Smite. You can only get either Burning Smite or the gem slot, and you really want to have both, which is a big problem for the flail here. Now Michael is at least a little bit more interesting. Michael is a Kite Shield, and keep in mind that you're only getting the stagger on Arcane Smite on the flail when you're using a Kite Shield. So there is reason to use a Kite Shield now. Most flail builds are using a Kite Shield, so this is something that would definitely be up for consideration. The first perk here is Refreshing Cleanse. Your cooldowns are reduced by 5%, which is on every Kite Shield now, and on block, lose 1 debuff. This is very potent. I think this is probably the strongest perk of this item overall, because debuff cleanse can be very nice in certain situations. It depends a lot. It's not always consistently equally useful, and I think that's the biggest problem with it. Sometimes you get a lot out of this, and sometimes the enemy won't put many debuffs on you and they just burn you down, in which case you won't benefit from this nearly as much. The secondary perk is Counterattack. On block, gain a 30% in power for 4 seconds. This is a very strong perk and particularly useful with the flail, because for example, if you charge forward with the barrage ability, then you can block. You have that perk that allows you to block and not lose any stamina while blocking, and if anyone attacks you during this time while you're charging into them, you immediately get counterattack. So this is a very, very good perk to have, and that's what kind of redeems Michael a little bit between the cleanse and the counterattack. That's solid. The next perk is once again Healing Defense, which is once again not very impressive, not very good, not really something I would invest into. And then we have Life Stealing as the next perk, which is once again the same thing as on Odo. It kind of feels like they think that every tank weapon should have a bunch of life stealing effects or healing effects, and like just kind of not good enough to really justify them in these situations, in my opinion. We also have an extra slot here where we can put something in, but we have a gem restriction in this case, so no gem slot here. Now, if you are purely PvE tanking, and that's your main goal, and you don't really care about the stagger on Arcane Smite or on Burning Smite, then I think the wall is a great option. I talked about some issues with the wall at the moment, but especially once that's fixed, I think this will be good for PvE tanking. So that topic is done. That's not our main focus here, though what we'll talk about in that context as well are the weapons you'll use along with it. But if you do want to have the stagger, if you do want to use a Kite Shield, then I have some much better suggestions for you. And the first one of those is Immutable Resolve. Now, Immutable Resolve is a very interesting kite shield that comes with 3 illegal perks. The first one is Shield Aggression. This does not come with the usual cooldown, but instead comes with 4.5 base damage instead. Keep in mind these values are slightly lower than on a 700 shield, but not that massively that I would say it's an issue. Then Immutable Resolve also has Thrust Shield Ward, and it has Slash Shield Ward. It has this double mitigation going on here, along with Sturdy. And this has been in the game for ages, and I was always saying if kite shields are ever good, this is gonna be top tier. Thing is, kite shields weren't good back then, they are now, and this is one of the hardest farms in the game just because the drop rate is incredibly low. But the amount of extra survivability you get from this, plus some extra damage, is just absolutely insane. You can put, for example, a Flame Protection Amulet or Void Protection Amulet with that, and you've covered almost all the damage that you're getting hit with in, for example, arenas or most open world situations. It does not provide you with the same offensive utility that some other options have, but in return you just get so much more survivability that this is kind of in the same territory as some tower shields, but rather the mitigation is more applied to you directly, especially when you're not able to block, which is massive. As far as we were able to find, this is only active while you're holding your shield, not while you are on your offhand. This is worth keeping in mind, but I mean, you can play around that obviously and just use your shield in situations where you're taking a lot of damage and then switch to your more damage-focused weapon after maybe. Now, Immutable Resolve drops from Erlander in the Palace in Evanscale Reach, near the Dynasty Shipyard. And this guy has an absolutely insane drop table. You can see that he has this full name set here, as well as this full name set. And then behind that we get to the old ones, the 625 weapons. We have 2 here, then we have another 2 here, and then we have Immutable Resolve. I think Immutable Resolve only competes with these 4 other named legendaries as well as Weaver's Shoes. It might also be competing with the other named items here. I think not though, but either way, even between those 6 items, your chances to get that, when the chance to even get one of those drops is only 10%, is incredibly low. So this is a very, very tedious farm. I'm warning you ahead of time. Fortunately, he drops more than one shield that can be useful for you. The other shield, which I'm currently using because I haven't gotten an Immutable Resolve yet, is the Taiyi Kite Shield. This shield comes with a normal cooldown reduction, so this has refreshing defense, which may be preferred by some of you as well, like depending on what your exact playstyle is. It comes with refreshing move, and it comes with counterattack. And refreshing move on your shield is very nice because it means you don't need to get refreshing move on your weapon. And that is very useful for the flail because there are multiple perks that are only available on the weapon. And also any flail perk that you put on your shield will be weaker. The effect is reduced, it's treated as armor instead of a weapon perk in that regard. So you want to have any ability perk on your weapon and not your shield, which kind of means you need a lot of room for perks on your weapon, and it's great if you can put refreshing move on your shield. The secondary perk here is once again counterattack. Already talked about this being good, and again you can use this to charge in and then deal more damage if you are in barrage with the extended form of it and blocking attacks from your enemies while charging in. So fantastic perk, 2 fantastic perks locked here, and then you have the random third perk. And I don't know what's up with the perk buckets here, but certain things are just not in here. For example, Sturdy is not in here, but this has an insanely high chance to roll refreshing, which I think is a fantastic third perk to have, unless you already have too much refreshing elsewhere. But if you don't, if you want to get better perks on your armor, then having one of your refreshing on your shields is great in my opinion. And that's exactly what I got, basically as a consolation prize. Before we talk about the best in slot flail perks, we need to very briefly talk about Trip here, because this is a very important effect. So you have your knockdown part, and then at the very end of it, you've got Destabilize, which is the follow-up heavy attack. And this effect is in fact a heavy attack. There are 2 perks in the flail tree that get applied by this, and along with that, it also applies any effect that other than that applies through a heavy attack, and that includes things like Transient Strikes, for example. Keep that in mind, it will be important in a moment, but first we need to look at Burdening Smite here. This gives us 35% cooldown increase against targets hit by Arcane Smite. Absolutely insane. This can bump cooldowns higher than what they start at, especially if the enemy has some refreshing. You can technically, under the right circumstances, infinitely extend someone's cooldowns. They can never use an ability again if the cooldown is long enough. It's just absolutely ridiculous. It's so strong, I cannot overstate it. In any PvP situation, you absolutely want to have this perk. Which also means that your build will automatically have to have Arcane Smite. And since it only scales properly on your weapon, you will have to put it on your flail. The second most important perk, in my opinion, for any PvP situation again, is Plagued Strikes. Because this applies from heavy attacks, it applies from your trip, so you get a guaranteed 26% healing reduction for 8 seconds the moment you hit this ability, which is just insanely strong. You hit this at the end of your combo usually, so just when someone is finally getting out of your combo lock, they are getting hit with anti-heal and they're getting hit with another rend from the ability itself all of a sudden, so it's gonna make their life even worse. And if you want to make their life even worse than that, you go for the Toxic 3 perker and go for Transient Rend as the last perk. Give them a 16% rend for 7 seconds as well, and then you just switch over to your other weapon and absolutely obliterate them. Now there are some other options that you can go with. You can, for example, go with Transient Strikes if you want to have some extra damage on your flail itself, though in my opinion in general the flail just doesn't do enough damage to justify that. I've tried more damage focused build with the flail, and your offhand just always does more damage unless you're running Life Staff. If you cannot get these perks, I think a great alternative is Plagued Crits as well. You don't get it on the strike, but you get it more consistently in other situations, which is still not bad at least, but this is a bit more conditional because it only applies under 50% health as well. And considering that the other 3 perks are very hard to roll together at all, the chances are very low. If you find a flail that has this instead, still a very solid option if you can get it for cheap enough. If you're not running an offhand shield with refreshing move, like for example you're running the wall or you're running Immutable Resolve, then putting that on your weapon can also be a good idea. I think the first perk I would swap out in that case is Transient Rend. I think overall this is a very nice effect to have. I would not necessarily rate it higher than the others, but it's still good. It's just that I personally don't spam that many lights and heavies with my flail most of the time. I usually swap to my other weapon until my cooldowns are back up, so it's not my highest priority, but definitely a good perk. There are more niche outliers like Keen Speed, or you could go for damage perks or attunement or something like that, but generally I don't think that is worth it. The flail is almost entirely a utility and setup weapon in my opinion, and I would much rather swap to my other weapon that has more impact in most situations and get additional effects from the flail that help me on my other weapon, which I get through anti-heal or rends. In terms of gems, I would probably go with either Opal or Jasper. Typically Opal is valued higher, but in this particular case, Jasper can be fine. I like Opal in so far that if you are CC locking an enemy, you still get the extra damage without taking any damage. But often with the flail you are also taking damage, you're in a situation where you're taking damage, that's why you're on the flail. So the extra Empower from Jasper can be good. Normally Empower from Jasper can be a problem because it's an Empower. For the flail in particular, which doesn't have much inherent Empower, that is not really an issue. If you can afford it, you want to probably use a Runeglass version just so you can get extra hard rune ticks. So overall, self-crafted in my opinion, or farmed or whatever, is definitely the way to go for flails and kite shields, though Michael is not a completely horrible option if you don't have anything better or you want to have particularly the cleanse from it. I'll make a full updated flail guide in the near future, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you are interested in that and want to get notified when that comes out. And I will not talk about the stuff we talked about here today in that case, so that's kind of out of the way, so I can just purely focus on the flail info itself. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips in return, then you can do so on my Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. BiS Sloth, out.